Just a heads up, today's episode contains some extremely distressing themes, and I want to make sure that listeners know that those themes will be discussed pretty much as soon as we get started on the podcast. That includes distressing themes, child sexual abuse, suicide. If you're not feeling up to it today, please feel free to skip this episode. For 24/7 support, you can contact Lifeline on 13 11 14. Support is also available through 1-800-RESPECT. There are some support links in the episode description. Last year, the story of a French rape case and the woman at its centre, Gisèle Pélicot, captured global attention. 51 men, including her ex-husband, were found guilty of varying charges, including rape, attempted rape, and sexual assault. Now, just months after that shocking case concluded, another French case is in the spotlight, with the country's largest child sexual abuse trial set to begin this week.
Before you mentioned this trial in the office, I have to be honest, I hadn't heard anything about it. And it is so shocking and so unbelievable. For people like me who haven't heard anything about this, what do we need to know about this case in France?
Yeah, so this week, legal proceedings against a French surgeon called Joel Le Scouarnec will begin in the country's northwest. Now, he is a 74-year-old accused of sexually abusing some 300 people, mostly children, often while they were under anaesthetic in a hospital. Le Scouarnec specialised in abdominal and stomach surgery, but retired in 2017. And later that year, he was arrested and charged with raping 2 of his nieces, as well as a 6-year-old girl and another young patient. During that investigation, police seized child-sized sex dolls and more than 300,000 child abuse images from his house. Now, it was during that search that another really important piece of evidence emerged, which was 25 years worth of his personal diaries. So Le Scouarnec lodged thousands of pages where he appeared to describe in detail decades of assaults that he had perpetrated against young patients. He also wrote several times in those diaries, "I am a pedophile." Le Scouarnec denied the charges at the time, back in 2017, so there were 4 rape charges, and he said that the diary pages were mere fantasies. However, in 2020, he was found guilty of abusing all 4 children and sentenced to 15 years imprisonment.
There's a lot there.
Yeah.
As we said at the top, it's extremely, extremely distressing. And I do just want to again emphasize that if people listening to this are not in the right headspace, to just stop now and come back tomorrow, because this story actually does get worse. But just to go back to what you were saying, so he's already serving time for child sexual abuse. But this week's trial is a separate investigation. It relates to different allegations, right?
Exactly. So a separate trial is due to start later today in a court in Vannes, Brittany, and that centres around allegations that Le Scouarnec assaulted or raped 299 patients between 1989 and 2014. Of the alleged victims, 256 were under 15, including a 1-year-old baby. The oldest victim was aged 70 at the time of the alleged incident, but prosecutors say the average age of these victims is 11 years old. Now, the reason that I gave you that previous context about the 2017 investigation, when he was found guilty of the rape of those 4 children, is that the evidence uncovered during that investigation connected police to this investigation. So police continued their inquiries after he was convicted, suspecting that Le Scouarnec had perpetrated abuse against many, many others based on those 25 years worth of diary entries that I mentioned. So those diary entries included the names of hundreds of victims, alleged victims, and hundreds of dates. And that's where police started this investigation. So they ended up gathering the testimonies of around 300 alleged victims, many of whom they discovered were patients of Le Scouarnec when he was a surgeon. And that led to more than 100 rape charges and more than 150 charges of sexual assault to be brought against him.
You've spoken there about the fact that this man is a retired surgeon and that some of these claims centre around hospital settings, which adds just another layer to this extremely dense story. What can you tell me about that aspect of the case?
Yeah, so of the 299 alleged victims, investigators claim that most were assaulted in around a dozen or so different hospitals across France over a period of 15 years. Now, when this investigation was first made public in late 2020, French prosecutors said most of the children were abused while they were under anaesthetic or some kind of sedative treatment. That includes assaults in operating rooms and also assaults in hospital beds. The BBC spoke to some of these former patients who are now all adults and said they remember the surgeon, quote, touching them under the guise of medical examinations, sometimes even when their parents or other doctors were in the room. So I mentioned that he had specialised in stomach and abdominal surgery and so would conduct physical examinations pertaining to that. And that's what this quote from the BBC kind of alludes to.
Hospitals are, above all meant to be safe places, but they're also quite public spaces. Has there been any discussion, because I think this is what I can't quite get over, how a surgeon could allegedly abuse patients over such a long period without raising suspicion?
This case really has raised a lot of questions about potential shortcomings in the medical system in France and its legal system. And, these questions around if more could have been done to intervene earlier. Now, that's led to a 2004 incident coming under fresh scrutiny. This relates to an FBI discovery, actually, from US investigators. Le Scouarnec was investigated for viewing child sexual abuse images online after the FBI discovered that he was using the dark web to access child abuse materials. The FBI alerted French authorities, who then conducted an investigation. Now, the surgeon was convicted over possession of these materials in 2005, but he was handed a suspended sentence, a 4-month suspended prison sentence, which means that he didn't actually have to serve any time behind bars.
So what you're saying is that in 2005, he was convicted over the possession of child abuse materials.
Yeah.
He didn't serve jail time and he was allowed to practice as a surgeon after that time, because you said that he retired in 2017.
Yeah. So that same year that conviction was brought, he started working in a new hospital. Some of the staff there were aware of the investigation from, being in the industry and hearing other hospitals discuss the matter. But the hospital that he had started working at, that Le Scouarnec began working at in that year, he did not disclose the charge to them. But some of these concerned staff essentially called for his resignation. They questioned whether or not he should be working as a surgeon with children, but he refused to resign. And those staff eventually wrote to the hospital's director and a state regulatory body to express their concern. The hospital defended the surgeon. It actually promoted him to the head of surgery in 2005. And local authorities never brought any sanctions against Le Scouarnec. He then started working at another hospital in 2008. Management there knew about the investigation, but they disregarded this and hired him, and he continued to work there until his 2017 retirement. So, as you said, Zara, Le Scouarnec was never barred from practicing. And eventually this French advocacy group called The Child's Voice would call this a collective failure. And that's a discussion that has been reignited now around this trial. The Child's Voice also claims the court that convicted Le Scouarnec in 2005 failed in its legal obligation to notify the National Surgery Watchdog under the French Public Health Code. So, this argument that the court that convicted Le Scouarnec had an obligation to notify regulators to potentially look into removing him from being able to perform surgery to practice as a doctor, but that the process was, never adequately completed, that they were not notified.
Okay, so given the scale of the charges, how long is a case like this expected to last? And one of the remarkable elements of the Gisèle Pélicot case was that as a victim, she waived her right to anonymity and she spoke publicly and attracted, global attention to her case, to her cause. What do we understand about the alleged victims in this case?
So unlike the Gisèle Pélicot trial, we've got 300 alleged victims here who have not been named, though some of them have publicly come forward and spoken to various media outlets, and lawyers for some of those alleged victims have come forward. So there are some that have been named. Authorities have set aside 4 months for this trial to take place, and that really speaks to, the scale of the number of charges that will need to be worked through. So we'll expect to hear a lot more through to at least June. But one of the complexities of this case, like the Pélicot case, is that many of the alleged victims have very little recollection of the assaults that are alleged to have taken place because they were under sedation. Age is also a factor here, with many of those alleged victims too young to remember being in hospital or the time when these incidents took place, according to investigators. One of the lawyers representing several victims, Francesca Satter, she's involved in the trial and told the BBC that among her clients are the families of 2 men who did remember what had happened to them and who ended up taking their own lives. So those families will be fighting for justice on their behalf. Another alleged victim, a woman now in her 30s, told local news outlet France Bleu that she suffered unresolved mental health issues for years, never understanding why. Doctors had suspected that she'd suffered a childhood trauma, but it wasn't until police contacted her because her name appeared in those personal diaries that the memory of her alleged assault came flooding back.
A trial of this scale and I guess magnitude is fairly rare. Like the number of, as you said, the number of alleged victims is so great that I imagine there will be a lot of global attention again on it. I'm curious though, because in the Gisèle Pélicot case, what came with the case was this real groundswell of activism, I guess I'd call it, and certainly a push for legislative change. Are we seeing that same sort of reaction this time around?
Yeah, I think as you mentioned, Zara, we can only expect this kind of conversation to become louder and louder over the coming months. But there has already been this groundswell of support for the alleged victims, calls for reform from several advocacy and legal bodies. There is this group of 6 child protection associations in France that have formed a coalition to support the alleged victims. And they've called the trial, quote, an opportunity, among other things, to recall that the fight against sexual violence against minors cannot be carried out effectively without collective and coordinated work between community actors, public authorities, and judicial bodies. And this speaks to kind of those concerns about systemic failures and what failures may have allowed the alleged perpetrator to continue his abuse over several decades. This coalition argue that the trial is not limited to the judgment of an individual. They've said that it must also contribute to a collective awareness of the need to better identify, report, listen to, and protect children. Really, they've called on the French government as a whole to guarantee, quote, the proper functioning of its institutions to prevent these crimes from happening again.
Look, it's absolutely a case that we'll be keeping a close eye on. And as you just outlined there, the consequences and ramifications of a case like this, not just nationally, but also internationally. If today's episode has raised any concerns for you, you can contact 1-800-RESPECT on 1-800-737-732 or head to 1800respect.org.au for resources. Take care of yourself and we'll be back again this afternoon.